This is the Comics Alternative Euro Comics, reviews of Alone and Park Bench. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Euro Comics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Edward. And we're two guys with advanced degrees who love talking about comics.
That's right. And on this month's episode, Edward and I are going to engage in a discussion of Christophe Chabouté. We're going to be looking at two of his recent books from Gallery 13, Alone, and then Park Bench. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Euro Comics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yeah, for instance, a title that Derek covered last month, Calamity Jane from IDW, is 35% off at only $19.49. And that's a really long book and a really excellent historical western. Also, Jean-Claude Forest's Barbarella, adapted by Kelly Sue DeConnick, a recent book that's been making some waves, is only $17.47 at 30% off.
That's right. You know, great discounts at dcbservice.com, and it's a go-to place to educate yourself when it comes to comics in translation, or really any kind of comics whatsoever. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Edward and Derek sent you. So, Edward, it's been a little while since you and I spoke. How have things been with you?
They've been, well, I like to say that having an infant is like flying to Hong Kong on a daily basis.
I haven't heard that before.
I do feel jet lagged.
Yes. My heart goes out to you, my friend. I remember what it was like when Zach and then Zoe were really, really young. And there are a lot of good times and good memories, but there were also memories of sleeplessness.
Yeah, no, it's been a bit tough, but yeah, of course, it's never tough when you're actually with her. It's more like I mean, she's very sweet, and she's got a great face.
Yeah, well, I missed you with the January show, and I put January in qualifying quotation marks because it actually came out, that episode, in February. But as listeners of that show will recall, we needed to go ahead and do a review of those various IDW titles that we received last year. And I know that you weren't able to make it. No one at IDW was available to help me with that show. So I did it solo, and there were several times on that episode as I was recording that I wish I had you on the other end to help me with pronunciation, to kind of bounce off ideas about certain interpretations of the text. But they were good books. And as you pointed out in the DCB service bit, Calamity Jane is one of the top, I think, of those six, for me at least. Well, Edward, we're here on the February show, and we're going to devote it entirely to Christophe Chabouté. You want to go ahead and get started with that?
Sure. We're starting off with Alone.
Yes. Now, if the name Christophe Chabouté sounds familiar to listeners of the podcast, that's because Edward and I discussed his adaptation of Melville's Moby Dick in June of last year. And in fact, Moby Dick is his most recent book that he has published. And I think in French it was released in 2 volumes, if I'm not mistaken. But we're going to be looking at earlier works of his that have been translated, and both of which came out last year. Also, both of them were published by the Simon and Schuster imprint Gallery 13.
Was Moby Dick also Gallery 13?
No, it wasn't.
Okay,
Moby Dick, interestingly enough, was a Dark Horse book, which is interesting. I'm curious about why Moby Dick through Dark Horse, and then these 2 that we're discussing for this month at Gallery 13. Also in October, Gallery 13 is going to be publishing his adaptation of Jack London's To Build a Fire.
Yeah, I know that was a book of his that got some notice in France, and actually not one that I'm, I guess, somewhat curious about seeing, because it does seem like the kind of story that would be more suited to his talents. I think, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe Moby Dick was just something that Dark Horse thought had some recognition. I do think it's my suspicion, though I can't, prove it, that Gallery 13's investment in Chabouté is at least in part due to the representation of the woman who's credited with translating Alone, Ivanka Hanenberger, because she's a freelance comics agent who pops up a bunch in various places, and I assume that she's at least somewhat the motive force behind this. Though it could also be just that some Chabouté's moment has come, because these are books. While these books are all Chabouté's, they're from different publishers in France. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, that's not true. They're mostly from Glénat, just different imprints of Glénat. But for instance, the other book we're discussing this week, Park Bench, was published first by Jonathan Cape in the UK before Simon and Schuster in the US. Whereas Alone, I think, went straight to Simon & Schuster. So all the books seem to have slightly different publication routes. So maybe we're seeing like just sort of convergence of Chabouté interest, or maybe we're seeing, the fruits of an agent's efforts. I can't really say.
Yeah. Now, Chabouté's been around for a while, but I guess relatively speaking, he is a young creator because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Edward, his first book that was published in France, which is, I guess, translated as The Bold, came out in 1998. And then his second, which translates into English, A Few Summer Days, in 1998 as well. Or maybe The Bold was 1990. No. Hold on. Maybe, no, I'm getting this.
No, The Bold was 98. That's right.
98. Okay.
And Summer Days was 98 with Paquet, which is actually a Swiss publisher.
Okay. So I was correct.
But most of his books have been with Glénat, or the Vent d'Ouest imprint of Glénat, which is a major commercial publisher.
Yeah. I'm also going to be curious to see how this adaptation of London's To Build a Fire is going to be reading this fall. And I'll tell you why. As much as I enjoyed the Moby Dick book that you and I discussed back in June, there were parts of it that, I don't know, I was sorry that he didn't tackle, and I can't remember if you and I discussed this several months ago, is that the philosophical, I think, bedrock of Moby Dick is, for the most part, completely missing in Chabouté's adaptation, especially, and I don't think I mentioned this on the show, I don't think, but afterwards I was reminded of the quite famous pasteboard mask scene that takes place, I think it's in the mainmast chapter, where Ahab confronts the crew, and this is when he says, I'll give this doubloon to the first person who spots Moby Dick. And then he makes this speech about punching through the pasteboard mask of existence. And to me, that is a keystone moment in Moby Dick, but it's something that he didn't allude to at all. But I think with To Build a Fire, which is a much more containable narrative, unlike Moby Dick, which is sprawling and all over the place, and not only in terms of the action. But I think To Build a Fire, there's much more for him to rein in, or much less to rein in, and to represent in an adaptation.
It's like the folk wisdom about short stories making better movie adaptations because they can flesh out rather than novels, which they have to compress to make it a 2-hour movie. I think that's true as because of Chabouté's style. It generally seems. I mean, I know these two books that we're looking at are hugely long books, but longer, I think, than Moby Dick. If I'm not sure, of comparable length to Moby Dick. I no longer have the Moby Dick copy on hand, but I know that
page count wise, yes.
Storytelling wise, they're much more decompressed than Moby Dick, and I think he's probably better at a sort of decompressed storytelling that focuses on iconic moments rather than a faster paced narration that has to leave out large chunks of time. And I think that maybe is one of his fortes. Another thing that I think of as his forte, just based on these books, is this sort of dealing to some extent with solitude and solitary lives and lonely people. And I was thinking as I was reading these books, like it would be interesting to see if he could adapt Steinbeck, or something. He does seem to be drawn to older literatures of an older very I would say slightly uncontemporary views of life, because even Park Bench, which is nominally set in the present day, is missing a lot of the markers of what we would really think of as contemporary. I mean, it probably takes place, for all its present dayness, it probably takes place 20 years ago is more like.
Yeah. And I'm going to talk about that in the second part of the show when we get to Park Bench. But I think what you've mentioned in terms of the theme of solitude and the decompressed style of storytelling is a great segue into, I think, jumping in the detail of Alone. Now, as you mentioned, this book was translated by Ivanka Hanenberger. Its original publication, I think, was in 2008, and it in 2009 was an official selection of the Angoulême Festival. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the story, it's rather straightforward and simple. I mean, how would you describe the story of Alone to someone who was completely unfamiliar with this?
Well, the funny thing is that, the story is there's a deformed man living alone in a lighthouse where his parents were the lighthouse keepers, and when they died, he chose to remain there presumably because he was afraid of, he had never known anything else, and he was timid because of his facial deformity. And so the story is mostly about his inner life as he lives alone there, and how he slowly comes to make a decision about the direction he wants his life to go in. And there's kind of a frame. It's not really a frame, but there's in so much as there's a B story that kind of frames it. It's about a fisherman who's recently hired on a fishing boat, and he's curious about this hermit who lives alone because the fishing boat makes a weekly drop-off of provisions on this island. And it turns out that this fisherman is this young fisherman who's recently hired onto this boat that makes the drop-offs. He's a convict, ex-con who's gotten out of jail, and so he has his own sympathies for people who are marginalized by society or left alone. Mm-hmm. But the bulk of the book is a single narrative gambit repeated a good 5 or 10 times, which is the main character, the hermit's relationship with a dictionary, and how the dictionary spurs he kind of tosses it in the air and lets it fall open with a resounding boom on a tabletop, and he launches into an imaginative reverie based on whatever word his eye first falls on. It's kind of like in Kurosawa's Yojimbo when Mifune tosses the stick up into the air to see which way, or is it Sanjuro? But it's a Borgesian chance thing. He tosses up in the air and then sees what comes up, and then these provide Chabouté with the chance to really to illustrate vastly different genres within the same book, because he is able just, these flights of fancy and imagination on the part of the hermit. He's able to literalize them with images.
And the words that he understands completely, then the image that he has or that is generated, in other words, what we see as readers, looks fairly realistic if there is a particular word that he comes to in the dictionary, because he closes his eyes and just points, after throwing the dictionary down or dropping the dictionary. If it's something that he somewhat understands, then we get an image that is somewhat correct, but off in other ways. And if they're words that he has no understanding of whatsoever, at times we don't even get an image because it's not registering to him.
Yeah, though I would caution about the word realistic, because that's something I want to talk about with respect to Chabouté's art. So, I would say everything is depicted realistically, even when the images are, as you say, incorrect from our shared understanding of them. A more concrete example is he reads about oboes as an instrument having holes and keys, and he imagines something that looks like the body of a violin, but it has large holes pierced in it, and it has wind-up keys like you'd find on a wind-up toy sticking out of it at weird places. It's actually really a disturbing image to me. I find it really kind of gross, and I think but that's just a purely personal reaction. I think it's because I've read somewhere that things with lots of holes in them actually tend to turn people off in terms of purely visual images, and I don't know if that's something I read a couple months ago, and it was in a different context. It was talking about beehives and things, things that but I did find that the image kind of off-putting to and I know it wasn't actually meant to be off-putting, it was meant to be purely comic, but as a side note, but that's the kind of thing he'll misconstrue something based on his limited understanding.
Right.
But Chabouté's art is, I think, across the board presented in an extremely realist style. And I think that's important. I don't want to hijack and go into a discussion of the art right away, but I do think that's important to note.
Oh yeah, and when I said realistic, I meant the hermit's conception of a word that he doesn't completely understand or that he can't place through his experiences. It's an image of something that doesn't correspond to what most people's reality would be. Like you mentioned the oboe. Another example would be French horn. I mean, he looks at the word French horn or the phrase French horn, and he doesn't have a complete image of what one looks like. And it is interesting that becomes a particular pattern that we find, as you suggested, throughout this narrative or throughout much of it, until we learn that that's what he's doing. In other words, dropping the dictionary and then picking a word at random and then fantasizing in some ways about what that might mean. There are things that we see. I mean, we visually see him doing this before we actually see the hermit. In fact, one of the sailors, one of the fishermen that you mentioned, refers to him as Alone, because we don't know his name, but we call him Alone. So
yeah, I should mention that the French title is actually All Alone, but I don't have the French book on hand, so I can't tell if that's actually what they also call him or whether they just call him Alone. I do think Alone on its own instead of All Alone is a better title,
right?
And a better. I think All Alone has the same impact in French but if you say All Alone, and just the added modifier in English actually weakens it somehow, instead of intensifying it when you want something to be crisp and short and succinct like a title. So but I don't know if that's what they call them in French.
Also, the word alone by itself kind of underscores itself instead of all alone. But no, I mentioned his name, or at least one of the sailors calling him Alone, is kind of maybe a shortcut. We can refer to him as Alone because that's one of what one of the characters in the book refers to him as. But before we even see him, and actually we don't see Alone or the hermit's face until page 109.
Out of,
I think, a few out of 400. It's not quite 400 pages.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that. But yes, yeah, I agree.
And now a couple of pages before page 109, we do see one or two silhouettes of him from a distance, but we don't know who he is as a character, or we don't have much reason to understand why he is by himself there on the lighthouse. But then when we see his face, we do notice that he is physically deformed, and that kind of fills in some of the questions readers may have. Why is this guy here by himself? Why is he alone? Why doesn't he interact with other people? But we see him, so to speak, or at least very indirectly, engaging in his dictionary game through certain images that appear earlier in the narrative, but we don't know, at least I didn't know, what the hell that they referred to. It's like, why all of a sudden is Chabouté interspersing images of a lighthouse and seagulls with horses? And that doesn't make sense until you find after page 109 what the hermit, what Alone does is he drops the dictionary, picks a word, and then imagines what that would be to him. And so then all of that you saw earlier begins to make sense. So I thought that was a really interesting and effective narrative strategy, because in the first part of Alone, the book, there are a number of teases. For example, it's not until page 22 that you actually see a human being. Before that, it's a series, very serene and measured series of images of a seagull or seagulls as they're flying around in front of the lighthouse. And there's something that suggests aloneness even before you get to any humans in this story.
Yeah, I agree. I do think the beginning is actually the most seductive. Setting up the mystery is the most seductive and beguiling part of this book for me, more so than once the book actually, the story gets underway, possibly because there really isn't much story to speak of. But I did want to note that, I do think it's very deliberate and fairly clever, is that you only get one sound effect in the entire book, and it is this repeated boom, and it's the boom of the dictionary dropping. And the first few times it happens, I didn't know what that boom referred to. I thought the boom was, the crashing of the waves against the. But I do think there is some, nevertheless, even though the early imaginative reveries that are unexplained on first read, do seem are unexplained. I don't think they're not entirely unmotivated. Is that because here's the weird thing is that, for instance, the first one is the lighthouse alone at the lighthouse on its own at night segues to the foliage of a tree, the complicated foliage of a tree, and then this kind of giant shot from below of a tree extending up into the heavens, and for me. Granted, like you, I didn't know reading it through the first time what was actually going on, but I thought it was, I guess the first time through I read it as just a extended visual metaphor, because it is visually tied to the lighthouse, just as the horses are visually tied to the galloping waves. So he does provide visual segues for the first ones that kind of easier, especially since the easier understanding and transition of these scenes without giving you a clue as to what's actually, without revealing what's actually going on. But so I think the visuals there are carefully chosen because they work with your later understanding, but they still work on a first read. They're not completely disorienting and out there on their own.
I think that's a great point that you just made. And in fact, right now I'm looking at page 65, and this is where we have, I guess, the last or the ultimate image of that tree. You mentioned that we get images of leaves and then branches and then a full tree. And on page 65, we have the tree from a particular perspective, and it's at a certain angle. And then below that is another image of the lighthouse at night at that exact same angle. And then if you turn the page to 67, you see the aforementioned horse, And the last image with the horse on the field is a long horizontal strip of the grass that the horse had been galloping on. And then you have a similar visual horizontal strip underneath that, which is the ocean. And then we're given the lighthouse again on that following page. So I think that's a great point, that in terms of image or icon, there are these associations made. But on a more textual or semantic level, those images of the horse and the tree and the leaves are a little confusing, at least at first.
Yeah, and I remember what I was going to say now is that well, one thing that's true about both of these books is that I would say that most of the time he's using the equivalent of an omniscient third person, right? But he can dip into close third, because even when he goes into someone's point of view, I feel like it's in Park Bench it's generally only for a panel or two. In Alone, it's arguably more sustained because he goes into the headspace of Alone as he imagines. But nevertheless, I feel a certain distance. I feel like he never goes into first, and he never goes into like free indirect style, right? Like he I feel like there's always a certain distance in the way he chooses his images, just in terms of angle. Because I think it's what it is that it's that you're always aware of, because the images are elegantly composed and because they're arranged in a stately sequence. I'm aware of like these are author chosen images rather than necessarily their angle is author chosen, their content is their composition is author chosen. I don't credit them to the characters, and that's interesting because like that impacts how we read and reread sections of Reverie, right? I mean, I feel like it's the author drawing connections more often than I do that, like, this is really within the character's POV. But like I said, I like the beginning a lot. I think the beginning is a really good mood setting, and it's very, very leisurely in its unfurling. And it doesn't make me wonder, like, I may have mentioned this earlier, but like I was interested in To Build a Fire because I'm interested in what he does with solitude, and I would be interested in seeing what he did with something like the Count of Monte Cristo or something, because like I feel like there's a narrative that has these long sections has opportunities for these long sections of imprisonment, but also would force him to handle more plot than Alone does as well. And so like, because I do think by the end of Alone, or even well before the end of Alone, this book, I found myself often very distracted while reading this book. And you could argue that I'm not getting on its wavelength, its peaceful, tranquil wavelength, or because I think you could say, it's a book about distraction because it's about the ways this guy whiles away his time and distracts himself. But I don't think I was distracted in the ways that the author meant. I think I was more distracted in like, this is here we go with this narrative gambit again. My mind is wandering, and I think that's in contrast later to Park Bench, which is more of an ensemble piece and has a little bit more going on for it in me, and I wouldn't even call it plot, just in terms of event, number of characters. I feel like the variations that he runs through in this gambit of dictionary entries, it gets old a little faster than the book would like.
I felt the same of what you just said, that after a while, that game with the dictionary, I got a little tired of it. And so I appreciated it when the narrative would be broken up through other means. So for instance, we would go back to, the two sailors or fishermen on the boat. And, the younger sailor, the one who had been in prison, he becomes important because at one point you mentioned the empathy that he has for other individuals who are alone or in solitude. The younger sailor, unbeknownst to the skipper of the fishing boat or the whatever kind of vessel that is that they're on, when they leave a package for Alone, and I don't think we mentioned this yet, but the reason that I guess every month or every few weeks they leave a package there at the lighthouse for this hermit is because the skipper of the boat had made a pledge to the hermit's father before the father died that he would use the money that the father gave him to get supplies to make sure that the son who's living at the lighthouse didn't go hungry, that he had whatever he needed to survive. So what this young sailor does, the one who had been in prison, is he leaves a message in one of the packages asking him, is there anything special or anything else you want us to bring? And alone includes a response, images of the outside world. And toward the end of this narrative, we see what this young sailor has done to satisfy Alone in his request for images of the outside world, which I thought was quite touching. And I don't want to give away any spoilers, but what happens after that is to some degree predictable. And it's one of those predictable feelings I had that I didn't really know how the book would end until it ended the way it did. And then I felt, but of course, it couldn't have ended any other way. I don't want to say it's a pat ending. It was satisfying, but then once I got to the end, it just seemed to make sense.
No, but to be fair, there is a little fake out right before the end, and I think the fake out really helps because here's the thing about both these books. I think are fairly sentimental books, and that's not necessarily a knock on them, but I think it's not inaccurate to say. And
okay.
And so like
I agree.
But there's a tiny fake out right before the end when it seems like the book might go darker, and I'm grateful for that because I think it needed that.
No, I'm glad that you mentioned that. And again, we don't want to say what the fake out is, just as we don't want to give away the ending because those would be spoilers. I had forgotten about that fake out, so I'm glad that you reminded me of that. But yeah, up until almost the very end, I had thought that it would go in a darker direction.
Yeah. No. I mean, the only other narrative interruption of these dictionary cycles is there's a point where a vacationing douchebag
Kevin and his girlfriend
ditches his girlfriend on the island out of in a fit of pique for like about a couple hours, and then comes by and picks her up again, and that really just serves to allow Alone to like ogle a woman because he doesn't get to see them very often. But so I don't know if you recall my complaints about Chabouté way back on Moby Dick, but one of them was that I thought sometimes his use of black and white could get confusing because it was always so kind of high contrast and flat. And I don't think that's the case in this book. I think it's handled very well. But then another one of my complaints was that his faces tended to look like each other, and I would get them confused in Moby Dick. And again, I don't think that happens in this book so much because there really aren't that many faces.
Yeah, we only have 5 people. There are only 5 people who populate this narrative. There's Alone, the 2 fishermen, and then the girl that you mentioned and her boyfriend, Kevin, and that's the only name we know, actually.
Right, and for a minute, I thought Kevin was the young ex-con. For a minute, just because, like, if you had to pick faces that look like each other in this book, that was the only one. Everyone else is clearly delineated, or just very different in age, or very different in but it brings me to Chabouté's faces, because here's the thing: is that I was trying to figure out why I'm not a huge fan of his faces, and I'm thinking, okay, so first I think, okay, is it his faces always seem cartoonier to me than everything else, and it's like, okay, but that's fine. There's a tradition of that. That's basically ligne claire, right? Where you have in the clear line you have extremely realistic backgrounds, and you have very cartoony faces and people. But then it's like, but this isn't. So is this like maybe his personal twist on ligne claire? But it isn't really, because his backgrounds really are not detailed. His backgrounds, they can be detailed. Like, I think some of the best work in this book is his sort of just silent cutaway shots of the insides of Alone's room. The little collection of objects he has, like leaves, twigs, an acorn, a postcard, photo of his parents, the little things he's picked up, flotsam and jetsam he's picked up. I think those are really sensitively done, and they do much more to characterize Alone than his interactions, for me at least, than his interactions with the dictionary or his face. I find his face much less expressive than those objects, right? And fine, that's also true of lonely people. So you can say it's deliberate but like I'm trying to figure out what my problem is with his faces, and I think really where the cartooniness leaks into them is their eyes. And so I'm thinking, okay, so it's their eyes that bother me. Like, are they uncanny, or are they just cartoony? Like, what is it? And here's the thing: is you mentioned those postcards that Alone requests from the outside world, and if you look at them, this brings up the question of, I don't know from. Like, I haven't read interviews with Chabouté, so I don't know how much photo referencing he's doing in his art. But those seem like those and certain shots of the lighthouse seem very photo referenced. When he copies out those postcards, the people in the postcards, either their eyes are not open, or they're seen from far away enough that they don't have to have detailed eyes, but they all look like photo people. Whereas the actual characters, they look kind of like photo people with cartoon eyes. And I think it's that combination that bothers me. I mean, it's not, again, this is not like a knock on him, because he's allowed to have his style, and I'm allowed to be weirded out by it. And I think, so we're avoiding the problem in both these books that I had with Moby Dick of people looking like each other, but what I'm getting instead is these people and their eyes are weird, especially when he can draw people that don't look like that. And another comparison in this book is one of the dictionary examples brings up a battlefield, and for some reason all the a battlefield, like a Roman battlefield with spiky gladiator helmets and spears, and all those people have eyes and they look like cartoony. But then when you go to the orchestra, the entire when Alone pictures the entire orchestra, most of those people don't have eyes. And they look really photorealistic. And for me, though, their photorealism blends better into the general aesthetic of the backgrounds and everything. Even though the backgrounds aren't detailed, they don't have to be detailed, but they're photorealistic. And that's the reason I wanted to question the word realism when it was brought up earlier, because for me, it's clear that he can draw extremely photorealistic things, and some things that even seem to definitely be photo-referenced. But when he actually decides to draw people, he lends them this cartoon touch that for me is focused in their eyes, and it's a slightly off-putting cartooniness.
Yeah. No, when I used the word realistic early on in our conversation, I wasn't referring to his art style. I was referring to the way that images that were apparently going on inside of the protagonist's Alone's head were to one degree or another more or less realistic to what we know those objects to be.
Yeah, another thing is his animal eyes are never weird, right? His animal eyes are also fairly photorealistic. Right? Anyway.
Yeah. So one takeaway from this Chabouté episode is you're weirded out by his eyes.
Yeah, I find his eyes cartoony in a way that is not cartoony in a way that doesn't mate with the rest of the art for me.
Okay.
But here's another point about the realism is that if you describe this story to me, or Park Bench for that matter, if you described either of these stories to me and told me it was an American book, I would not ever have predicted that it would have been in a style as remotely realistic as this, because you describe these things to me, and I can see them being American books. Americans have tons of sentimental comics like this, but it would be in this kind. The fable element would be, I think, a lot more visible in the art. It would be. I'm not saying this is purely an American thing. Like I mean, I could see other French creators doing the same thing, but I feel like if you described just a story to me and then told me it was a comic book, I wouldn't picture this sort of. And I do think that the photorealistic art, I'm not sure what it does for or against this kind of very simple fable atmosphere. I mean, you can see it working in certain animated movies, right? Like there's an animated movie that some Dutch fellow made with Studio Ghibli in Japan called The Red Turtle, I think, from either last year or the year before, and that was very. Studio Ghibli has a very lush, pictorial, quasi-realistic style, at least for backgrounds, and this was very much a lot of long shots, a lot of and it certainly worked for that movie, but it wasn't black and white. So like I wonder, like I mean, to what extent does photorealistic art mate with a story that is so stripped down and fable-like? Because I mean, like when I think of prose stories that are trying to do this too, the prose is not particularly realistic. The prose has this kind of vague remove that makes it sound like a fable. So I gotta say two more things about this about Alone, though, is that I do think I don't know for sure because I don't have the French book on hand. I was only able to Google up certain select pages from the French book on Google Images. And I do think there's probably some credit to be given to the translation in how they handle the dictionary elements, because I'm sure that the dictionary words were not the same, right? Like, I mean, the main ones were always the same, but the one right after it, usually you can kind of see 1.5 or 2 entries. And so like to give a concrete example, battle is followed by battle axe. And I think in the French version, it's battle is followed by the verb to battle, right? Because they're different words. So then, they had to do some fudging there, and I think they did it. That probably took some ingenuity in the translation, and that's to be praised. But then at other times, I do think the dialogue is. I can't judge the whole book. I don't have the whole French to compare, but in a couple instances that I did see, I felt like the dialogue was pared back a little too much to it. Especially dialogue between the older fisherman and the younger fisherman. It's a little saltier in the French, and in the English, it's a little flatter and a little more succinct. Like they're just getting across what needs to be gotten across instead of like adding like little like well, ahem, kind of things that would give it more flavor. And the reason I first looked at that is because the font they used in this book really bothers me. I understand it's a standard font. It's a standard comics font, but I really feel it does the book a disservice, and I felt this early on. I just felt like, especially when they magnify and like increase the point size, and I think they do that because I'm sure they do that in the French to some extent, but I think they also do that because they have to fill white space because all these English translations are shorter than the French, and I to make sure that I'm like, so then I'm questioning myself, like, was I bothered by the font in Moby Dick? And I'm like, I wasn't. But then when I looked up the Moby Dick font in English, they didn't use, it wasn't a standard. It looked very much, it's just a few degrees away from the font they use in Alone, but it's not the same. And when I look at the French version of Alone, it's also not the same. It's a few degrees away from the standard comic font, but it's clear, the S's are different, the letters are different. And I think just that little bit, because to me, when you have a few English words in a very standard font surrounded by a bunch of white space, it really makes them glaring. And it looks to me like someone just slapped in this dialogue digitally, which is true, but like, I guess it did bother me a bit, and also, this is a very tiny nitpick, but on the other hand, like they say about lettering like translation, right? They're invisible professions, which means they're only visible when someone gets something wrong, and I feel like here they did bother me. It felt like mismatched.
Well, okay, so let's move on to Park Bench, and I'm curious, maybe a starting point there would be me asking you, were you as bothered with the kind of things that you've just mentioned in Park Bench as you were apparently with Alone?
Well, there are no words in Park Bench. Hey, I mean, there's no dialogue. So,
well, I mean, but there are other things that you brought up as well, that there's no dialogue, but there is text. And we need to point this out. I mean, there are words, like, for instance, things that are either carved into or painted on, the titular park bench, which is a central part of the story. But no one speaks. You're right.
Yeah, and the fonts were not changed, right, for that. I mean, the fonts, maybe the only font that might have been changed is a newspaper headline, but everything else, the things that are carved into the bench, we're not talking about a change in fonts here. So, like, I don't think that's an issue here. We can talk about my issue with his faces, but actually I think that
we have more faces in this one.
That calmed down for me. And I think the reason why is because here in this one, it's interesting is that he does an incredible job differentiating faces in this one. He's got a huge cast here, and I really appreciated how, like, for me, it was like I don't know, it brought to mind slightly McGuire's here, right? In that it's tied to a single location, right?
Yes, right? Yeah.
But he's got an incredible array of faces, ages, types of people, and he handles them. They're all extremely distinct. And when I talk about his faces looking the same, it's not like, I mean, for me, it was like in Moby Dick, it was like two people with totally different hairstyles could still kind of look the same just because their actual features were the same. Whereas here, I feel like the incredible variety of, facial hair, accessories, ages, hairstyles, dress. He does a great job differentiating. The only ones where like I hiccuped a little bit were like sometimes the little kids look a little like older than they. I don't know. Little kids are so hard to handicap because
Yeah. I agree with you in terms of most of what you said in terms of the people looking more distinct in this one than in, say, the Moby Dick adaptation or even Alone. But there are some cases where there are, if you think about it, different people being represented, but whose facial features did look quite similar. So, but again, we're dealing with a larger ensemble in Park Bench. With Alone, arguably, we only had 5 characters. We see more than 5 people, but those other than the 5 are within the imagination of the hermit alone. Now, with Park Bench, we have a lot of different people and also animals. I mean, one of the most significant creatures, I guess we could say, in this story is a dog, because we keep seeing this dog over and over again. And in many ways, this is, as you mentioned with Alone, a decompressed narrative, at least to some degree. With Park Bench, this is basically the story of the many individuals and even animals that use a park bench or that are associated with a park bench over time. Yeah. And so, it's funny. I hadn't thought about McGuire's here, but there's something somewhat similar going on here, obviously within a much more condensed time period.
No, it's much simpler. It's not as ambitious. It's not as complex.
It's a different kind of story, so I wouldn't expect it to be, the same. But basically what you have is a park bench in a location. It's in front of a tree, and we see this same geographic space over time. And what Chabouté does is he will represent the passage of time through certain visual signifiers that anyone can get, right? So when we go from winter to fall, we go from from fall to winter, we get from falling leaves to snow, and then springtime, we get people wearing fewer clothes. So there are those kind of things. But there are also other time signifiers that are visually represented, where you will have individuals, either a single individual or maybe even, at least in one case, a pair of individuals who will change, or their relationship will change over time. And that's another way that we can gauge the passage of time in this book. And basically, it's a series of vignettes of people and a dog who are using or associating with a park bench. And there's certain figures that keep cropping up again and again and again to varying degrees. One's the dog. We have a businessman who throughout most, not all, of the narrative just passes by without even giving the park bench a single look. There's another important character is a homeless individual and the policeman that always seems to be on site whenever the homeless guy sits down or lays down on the bench. There's an elderly couple that seems to almost always share pastries. There's a man with flowers. There's a woman who's reading a book, an older woman. There's also a park worker. There's a skateboarder. There is a musician with a tin cup. And there's a woman with freckles who we see her early on. She doesn't seem to be one way or the other outside of a woman who's reading a letter. Then later on, she looks a little bigger. Then later on, she has a baby. And so these are just some of the characters who seem to populate this relatively limited narrative, but I think it's really effective. I mean, when you describe this to someone, it's like, oh, it's a story about the many people who use a park bench and how they're interconnected to some degree or another. It sounds simple, but I think that this was a book that, I mean, I liked Alone probably better than you did, but I think I appreciated, or at least enjoyed, Park Bench more than I did Alone.
I do think Park Bench was a huge breath of fresh air for me after Alone, because I felt Alone was kind of dragged. And then Park Bench, for all that it's limited to a single location, I never felt like it dragged. I felt like, I mean, it sounds repetitive in its way because you keep seeing the same people, but the variations are, you know, what it reminds me of is like Dean Mullaney. We were recently talking about Otto Saglow's The Little King and how Mullaney edited the Library of American Comics and designed the collection of it. And he's like, people accuse Saglow of being repetitive, but as I read like more than 400 strips to like cull this collection, and what I actually feel like is that he's returning to the same setups and themes over and over again and bringing variations on them. And I do feel like that, like Park Bench almost has the feel of like nested, interconnected strips. I mean, they're not strips in the sense of in concision, and pacing, they're definitely not strips. But they do have. It does feel like it feels like an ensemble film in that it's things are more measured by before repeated glimpses of befores and afters than they are by. You're not actually seeing things happen. You're seeing before and afters, and you're. And that's drawing you into the story because you're imagining the things that happened. But I also think there's like visually more grace notes in here for me than there were in Alone. Like in Alone, there was one panel that really stood out to me. It was late in the book when he's when he's looking at when he's sitting alone. Alone is sitting at his desk, and it's on 335 if you're interested. But he's sitting at his desk, and he's thinking about imprisonment and prison because of the dictionary. And then you see his window, his barred window, and then the postcards are little squares, white squares on the wall, and they almost look like the light from the barred panes of his window, but there has a little echo there. Whereas in Park Bench, I feel like there's a lot of little grace notes that I like for instance, when winter comes, and you've gotten used to seeing the dog come by and just pee on one leg of the bench, but then when winter comes, you see a series of footprints, and then you see a larger kind of melted area of snow around one corner of the bench, and then a couple of footprints leading off, and you know it's the dog without having seen the dog. And I thought, hey, that's really clever. Also like there's a surreal image of when the bench is upended because someone's painting the bottom, but he's temporarily gone away to get more paint. But the part that the side that's being lifted up happens to have a child's abandoned balloon tied to it, so it looks like the balloon is hoisting up part of the bench. And there's a lot of silent comedy too. I feel like like in terms of like the little gags that he pulls off when people are weirded out by something or misinterpret something, like the part where so one teenager comes with and eats a Happy Meal next to an old man who falls asleep, and when an old man wakes up, there's a huge, much fatter person sitting there next to the Happy Meal, and old man mistakes it for the same person. Like that's a silent comedy routine, right? That's
Well, what you just said, the humor in this book, I think that works with another element to this narrative, a characteristic of this narrative that you also mentioned, and that is the repetition with variation. I think that one of the things that this book has that Alone definitely doesn't have, or at least it doesn't have anywhere to near the degree that Park Bench does, is a sense of humor, or at least humor that's embedded, to greater or lesser degrees in the story. Yeah, there are those moments in Alone, but I think they're much more frequent and much more on the surface in Park Bench. And you've mentioned a couple of those that I think really stand out. The one with, again, the woman who has the Cartland book. She's the one who comes by that bench as it's upended with the child's balloon on it, looks at it, has a perplexed look on her face, and then walks away. And in fact, there are a few moments, humorous moments in Park Bench that involve this same woman. I think there's one example where she sits down and then someone who looks like a police officer sits down next to her, but he looks really scruffy, and she doesn't, and he rolls his own cigarette and he starts to smoke it, or at least it seems to be a cigarette. It may be something else. And she's wondering, what the hell is he doing? And then a couple of other characters who have different costumes on come by, and in essence, they're telling that police officer or someone who's dressed as a police officer, come on, let's go. So, okay, the guy was in a costume. He's not a police officer. So a lot of these humorous moments include the woman with the Cartland book. But there are other ones as well. There's on page 100 to 107, there's that scene with the musicologist. There's this serious-looking guy who is reading a book, and we don't know what it is at first. And then someone comes to sit right next to him, a young guy who has this kind of shaggy, almost Beatlesque hair, and starts playing on a guitar. We can't hear what he's singing, but it probably isn't the most pleasant of tunes. And then the young guy leaves, and then the serious-looking man who had been reading leaves, and we see as he's leaving that he has a book on musicology.
Yeah, he's a character.
The theory of music. Yeah, and
I mean, they're both characters, right? They're both recurring characters with their own arcs.
Okay. See, this is where we get back to your comment about the characters looking distinctive and my disagreeing somewhat. I don't know if that character, the guy with the book or the musician, are the same another guy who looks somewhat similar or another person who plays an instrument, because I don't think that it's easy to determine if they're the same or different characters, but really when it comes down to it, I don't know if we absolutely need to determine if these are the exact same characters. So for instance, the woman with the Cartland book at one point looked almost exactly like one of three women who came to sit on a bench earlier in the story.
Oh, I think she was.
But we don't know for certain. But my point is, I don't know if it's absolutely necessary to determine if it's the exact same person. But even if we can't, that does feed back into your earlier comment about Chabouté's characters having similar facial characteristics, even though they may be completely different people.
Well, I do think with the musician it is important, though, because with the musician is that he changes instruments, and then his final note is that he's changing instruments, and he always is identified by that panhandling cup where he never gets any money.
We're talking about two different musicians. The one you're referring to is the guy who has the tin cup. The one I'm referring to on pages 100 through 107 is a shaggy-haired guy who has his tongue sticking out, and we can't even see his eyes because of his hair.
Right, so he's just in there for the musicology gag.
Exactly, yeah. But I think that's a great point that you made, that there are parts of Park Bench that read almost like gag strips. And I think that, not that Park Bench could have been serialized as a newspaper strip, but it does have somewhat of a feel like that, because there is this repetition, but it is a repetition with a variation with a lot of humor injected. And I think that was the reason why I didn't feel that Park Bench was as much of, I was about to say a slog, but that's not the most positive word, as Alone.
No, but what really differentiates it from the strip aesthetic is its decompression, right? I mean, because Chabouté takes whole pages where very little happens between panels, whereas like in a strip, in the traditional strip, you're skipping a lot of time between panels. And you're hitting the punchline, very quickly. And I think And the thing is, and Chabouté's like default seems to be 3 or 4 wide panels per page, and that's the default for both books, I would say. So I don't know if it's just that, and I do think that a lot of Chabouté's books tend to be about this size and format in France. So I don't know if he's often working like that, because I know Moby Dick was a different size, and I don't remember what the average panel layout was for Moby Dick. But for these two books, his pacing is mostly 3 or 4 panels per page, long horizontal panels, occasionally going up to maybe 5 or 6 at tops when he's zeroing in on some action, or just changing the pace a little, and then going back to the 3 and 4. So like I mean, I guess for me, you're completely right about the humor. I think. I guess this book definitely felt a lot more zippy for me, but I do think on the whole, if I do, another complaint I have about Chabouté is that I don't think there's enough going on in each one of his panels to really, for me, as a reader, to really zen out to his decompressed pacing. Like I feel like his panel information content is really low, and it gets even lower when he switches to silhouette rather than like image. And then so for me, I think that's what kind of makes me zone out of his books, and maybe someone with a more easygoing or contemplative temperament would really enjoy this, because of I think for me it's like you can, I know you're not just, I know information content is not the sole criterion of any given image, but I do think that like there's, for me, it tends to err on the low side for him, and that's what makes it seem light. And I think what makes it seem sentimental is the way certain stories end. It's like the note that the arcs end on is like, oh, that's where this was going. Oh, okay, yeah. Sure.
Oh, yeah, I see your point, and we should resist, I think, actually articulating where some of these stories of the individuals in Park Bench may lead, and especially resist any kind of urge of mentioning the very end of this. Although I will say that when I saw the end of this, it was another one of those feelings that I had as with Alone. It seemed like it made all the sense in the world, but I didn't know if he would go in that direction, and I'm talking about Park Bench. But my experience in reading the very ending of Park Bench was somewhat similar to the phenomenological experience I had when I got to the very end of Alone. I didn't necessarily predict it, but once I saw the end, I thought, well, of course, why wouldn't it end this way? And so to that degree, it is, if you want to call it, somewhat predictable, but not necessarily in a bad way.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think another thing, I think this goes in hand in hand with the humor you're describing. I think there's a lightness of touch to Park Bench that I appreciated more than Alone. And also because Alone is being sold as this quote unquote stunning humanist fable, it carries a lot more thematic weight than Park Bench. I don't think Park Bench has that much of a grand design feel to it, like it's saying something about this or that.
At least on the surface.
Yeah. So I think that also helps it makes it feel lighter and more swallowable. It goes down easier.
I would agree with something earlier you said, if I could. You said that one of the things that seems to categorize Chabouté's narratives that, at least for you, that you've read, seem to be this theme of solitude. And I would agree to that. And, To Build a Fire, which is going to be translated and published by Gallery 13 this fall, I think is just another example of this theme in the body of his work. But I would also argue that, and I think that Park Bench is about solitude to some degree, but I would argue that if Alone is more about solitude, then Park Bench is about community.
Yeah, and one of the things that was interesting to me, Park Bench is very accessible, and I mean, any way you cut it, but like, I did try to figure out in the beginning, like, where is this? I mean, we established that it's not the present, no one has a cell phone, right? So like,
I was going to point this out, because this gets back to something that you mentioned early on, that for the most part, this could have been set decades previous to now. There are, and I went through and I have 2 examples where cell phones have an important component. And the first one is, I guess, the biggest example. And this begins on page 44 and ends on page
the couple.
46, where we have two people who come from different directions, both of them at the same time sit down on a park bench, but they're talking on cell phones when they sit down on the park bench. They never acknowledge the presence of the other, and then they walk off in other directions as they're talking on a cell phone. The other example takes place in that scene that you mentioned earlier, the old man and the guy eating fast food. The reason why the thinner guy who first brings the fast food, because of a phone call, right? So he has to walk away. But I think, unless I'm forgetting something, those are the only two instances in Park Bench where we have, I guess, contemporary technology. Other than that, though, I think you were right in that earlier statement that this could have been set, and probably makes more sense being set in an earlier time.
Well, no. Well, the thing is, so here's the thing. Here's the thing, is that, okay, and then where do you think it's set?
I think it's indistinctive. It seems to be set in a somewhat semi-urban place. I don't know if I would call it suburban, but it's a location where, in its place in a park, it's populated by people almost constantly during the day.
Sure. But here's why I think it's France, right? I mean, not only because the default setting of any French book is France, right, and because the original version would have had French lettering in it, where there is lettering, but but also because the cop's uniform is French, and the maintenance people's uniform is more French than American, I would think. I don't feel like park people always have the day glow vests in America, but they always do in France. But then, so here's what weirded me out, and it tripped me up early on, and then later on in the book I forgot about it because he doesn't come back that I remember. Is on 41 you have this older African American man pop up for like 3 panels, and he looks like a blues musician from the 1930s. Like, I don't remember African Americans, or rather people of African descent, dressing like that in France, or even contemporary America, really, anymore. Like, he looks like something from another. And so that was the only one where I was like, because in the beginning that's only 40 pages in, again, out of like a 330 page book. So at that point I hadn't yet decided yet. I was wavering back and forth between whether it was France or America, because I mean, it's clearly somewhere in the West, probably. But like, I mean, and many of the pastries look kind of French. But like, so I mean, this is not an important point, and it doesn't really matter in the end where this book is set. But like, it did strike me as weird because it's like he seemed anachronistic compared to other things.
Yeah, well, not being well versed in terms of, let's say, uniforms of France when it comes to the police or
especially
park
since
personnel.
He's the only
one
person
of the things,
color, right?
Well, no, I'm just okay. So what I was about to say is, since I'm not well versed in, French uniforms, police uniforms, park workers uniforms, I just thought that the way that Chabouté represented individuals and the setting, even in this book, Park Bench, is indistinct enough to where it could be set almost anywhere, let's say within the West. So maybe United States, I didn't necessarily believe that, though. It could be France, but it could be Italy. It could be Spain. It could be England. In other words, there's not an abundance of detail in the representations of both the setting and of the people who populate this story that lead me to think that, yes, this is definitely set in this nation or this region, unquestionably.
Yeah, and like I said, it's not a point that matters. But I mean, it was the African American or the black man that tripped me up, especially since he's the only person of color in the story, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to that degree, I think that there's something about Park Bench that has an almost everyman feel to it, and I mean that in a non-gendered way, by the way. In other words, you have, just as you had with, let's say, the classic, allegory everyman, it's a character that could fit any number of individuals over time, right? It wasn't limited in terms of time, space, or culture. And there's something about Park Bench that is somewhat similar in terms of what this story is about. And this gets back to an earlier comment that I made. It's about community. It's about what brings people together, even inadvertently, and even when they themselves don't realize that it's that which brings people together and connects one person to another.
Look, this is a very innocent book thematically. So, I mean, but I don't know if I want to go into the whole, like, what makes universal, what reads as universal kind of quandary.
Right. And one of the things I'm not doing, by the way, is taking my Western values and, both in terms of aesthetics and also in terms of narrative theme and applying it worldwide. But what I'm saying is there's something indistinct about Park Bench and the way that Chabouté represents setting and characters that it could apply to a variety of different cultures. I don't think I said every single culture, but I mean, there is something that is not anchored in the specifics in Park Bench, which I appreciate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I get a sense that after discussing with you both Alone and now Park Bench, I probably enjoy Chabouté more than you do. Is that a safe bet?
Yeah, I don't think he needs to be dinged for anything. I mean, I think it's great that he's getting over and all. There's no reason to. He definitely expands the. But like, I tended to like the slightly more open-ended stuff from last year. Like the Dominique Goblet and Manuel Fior's The Interview. The stuff that was a little. I wouldn't even call it avant-garde because I don't think of myself as like really going far into the. But maybe somewhere between there and this I think of as very mainstream, just mainstream in a way that is. I mean, it's hard to say that in the U.S. without the U.S. mainstream is so skewed in certain directions, but
right. And when you're talking about comics and mainstream, that has other meanings, whole additional meanings as well. No, I'm right with you in terms of privileging more ambiguous, less neatly tied endings in books. And I do think that there's something about Chabouté's books, at least the two that we're discussing on this episode, that seem to be neatly tied up at the end. And I think that gets back to that earlier comment that I made, that with both books, I just had a feeling that what I saw at the very end made sense to me, and to some degree was kind of predictable, even though I may not have predicted the exact ending. And while that to some degree could be satisfying, there is something about it that leads back to the feeling that you had, that there's something maybe sentimental with a small s about Chabouté's narratives that we've read.
The only other note I would say is that, here's a very contemporary note, but it does... I guess there's a sociological component to how Park Bench ends in terms of... right, and I don't mean the very ending, but I mean like... the trend toward what they call hostile architecture, right? Hostile public architecture, which is architecture that public spaces that discourage the very thing you were talking about, community, and also homeless people sleeping and whatnot.
Well, there you have it. Edward and I on this February, an actual February episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomic series. We looked at two relatively recent books or translations of Christophe Chabouté. We started off with Alone, and then we moved on to Park Bench, both of which were published late last year by Gallery 13, an imprint of Simon and Schuster. And we may visit Chabouté again later this year when that Jack London adaptation comes out. Who knows?
Indeed.
And if you want to find great books like this, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find a whole slew of comics at great prices, translations, and otherwise. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Right, or email me at edward@comicsalternative.com, or both of us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com.
That's right, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, Slack, Discord, and we have a YouTube channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we occasionally post on the blog, simply by going to the website comicsalternative.com. So, Edward, it was great doing this show with you again. I'm glad that I didn't have to do another solo show in talking about Chabouté, which actually I would have used fewer words if I did it solo, which would have gone hand in hand with the two Chabouté books. We'll be back next month with more books in translation. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Edward.
See you later.
See you later.